History of Sierra Leone. Published December the 12th, 2017. Special characters are denoted as follows. And. Beginning and ending single or double quotations. And. Left and right parentheses. An M dash. The history of Sierra Leone began when the land became inhabited by indigenous African peoples at least 2,500 years ago. The dense tropical rainforest partially isolated the region from other West African cultures, and it became a refuge for peoples escaping violence and jihads. Sierra Leone was named by Portuguese explorer Pedro de Sintra, who mapped the region in 1462. The Freetown estuary provided a good natural harbour for ships to shelter and replenish drinking water, and gained more international attention as coastal and transatlantic trade supplanted trans-Saharan trade. In the mid-16th century, the Maine people invaded, subjugated nearly all of the indigenous coastal peoples, and militarized Sierra Leone. The Maine soon blended with the local populations, and the various chiefdoms and kingdoms remained in a continual state of conflict, with many captives sold to European slave traders. The Atlantic slave trade had a significant impact on Sierra Leone, as this trade flourished in the 17th and 18th centuries, and later as a center of anti-slavery efforts when the trade was abolished in 1807. British abolitionists had organized a colony for black loyalists at Freetown, and this became the capital of British West Africa. A naval squadron was based there to intercept slave ships, and the colony quickly grew as liberated Africans were released, joined by West Indian and African soldiers who had fought for Britain in the Napoleonic Wars. The descendants of the black settlers were collectively referred to as the Creoles or Creoles. During the colonial era, the British and Creoles increased their control over the surrounding area, securing peace so that commerce would not be interrupted, suppressing slave trading and inter-chiefdom war. In 1895, Britain drew borders for Sierra Leone, which they declared to be their protectorate, leading to armed resistance and the Hut Tax War of 1898. Thereafter, there was dissent and reforms as the Creoles sought political rights. Trade unions formed against colonial employers, and peasants sought greater justice from their chiefs. Sierra Leone has played a significant part in modern African political liberty and nationalism. In the 1950s, a new constitution united the Crown Colony and Protectorate, which had previously been governed separately. Sierra Leone gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1961 and became a member of the Commonwealth of Nations. Ethnic and linguistic divisions remain an obstacle to national unity, with the Mende, Tem and Creoles as rival power blocs. Roughly half of the years since independence have been marked by autocratic governments or civil war. Part 1. Early History. Archaeological finds show that Sierra Leone has been inhabited continuously for at least 2,500 years. Populated by successive movements of peoples from other parts of Africa. The use of iron was introduced to Sierra Leone by the 9th century, and by the end of the 10th century agriculture was being practiced by coastal tribes. Sierra Leone's dense tropical rainforest partially isolated the land from other pre-colonial African cultures and from the spread of Islam. This made it a refuge for people escaping subjugation by the Sahelian kingdoms, violence and jihads. European contacts with Sierra Leone were among the first in West Africa. In 1462, Portuguese explorer Pedro de Sintra mapped the hills surrounding what is now Freetown Harbour, naming the oddly shaped formation Serra Leoa, Lioness Mountain. At this time the country was inhabited by numerous politically independent native groups. Several different languages were spoken, but there was similarity of religion. In the coastal rainforest belt there were Bulum speakers between the Sherbro and Freetown estuaries, Loco speakers north of the Freetown estuary to the Little Scarces River, Tem speakers found at the mouth of the Scarces River, and Limba speakers farther up the Scarces. In the hilly savanna north of all of these lands were the Sasu and Fula tribes. The Susu traded regularly with the coastal peoples along river valley routes, bringing salt, clothes woven by the Fula, iron work, and gold. Part 2. European contact. 15th century. Portuguese ships began visiting regularly in the late 15th century, and for a while they maintained a fort on the north shore of the Freetown estuary. This estuary is one of the largest natural deep-water harbors in the world, and one of the few good harbors on West Africa's surf-battered, windward shore. Liberia to Senegal. It soon became a favorite destination of European mariners to shelter and replenish drinking water. Some of the Portuguese sailors stayed permanently, trading and intermarrying with the local people. Part 2. European Contact. Chapter 1. Slavery. Slavery, and in particular the Atlantic slave trade, had a great effect on the region. Socially, economically and politically. From the late 15th to the mid-19th centuries, there had been a lucrative trans-Saharan trade of slaves in West Africa from the 6th century, at its peak. c. 1350. The Mali Empire surrounded the region of modern-day Sierra Leone and Liberia, though the slave trade may not have significantly penetrated the coastal rainforest. The peoples who migrated into Sierra Leone from this time would have had greater contact with the indigenous slave trade, either practicing that or escaping it. When Europeans first arrived at Sierra Leone, slavery among the African peoples of the area was believed to be rare. According to historian Walter Rodney, the Portuguese mariners kept detailed reports, and so it is likely if slavery had been an important local institution that the reports would have described it. There was mention of a very particular kind of slavery in the region, which was, quote, "A person in trouble in one kingdom could go to another and place himself under the protection of its king, whereupon he became a slave of that king, obliged to provide free labor and liable for sale." According to Rodney, such a person would likely have retained some rights and had some opportunity to rise in status as time passed. If the Africans were not much interested in acquiring slaves, the Portuguese, as well as the Dutch, French, and English who arrived later, certainly were. Initially, their method was to cruise the coast, conducting quick kidnapping raids when opportunities presented themselves. Soon, however, they found locals willing to partner with them in these affairs. Some chiefs were willing to part with a few of the less desirable members of their tribes for a price, others went into the war business. A large group of battle captives could be sold for a fortune in European rum, cloth, beads, copper, or muskets. This early slaving was essentially an export business. The use of slaves as laborers by the local Africans appears to have developed only later. It may first have occurred under coastal chiefs in the late 18th century. Quote, "The slave owners were originally white and foreigners, but the late 18th century saw the emergence of powerful slave-trading chiefs who were said to own large numbers of domestic slaves. For example, in the late 18th century, Chief William Cleveland had a large slave town on the mainland opposite the Banana Islands, whose inhabitants were employed in cultivating extensive rice fields, described as being some of the largest in Africa at the time. The existence of an indigenous slave town was recorded by an English traveller in 1823. Known in the Fula language as a round, it was connected with the Suli Masusa's capital city, Falaba. Its inhabitants worked at farming. Rodney has postulated two means by which slaving for export could have caused a local practice of using slaves for labor to develop. 1. Not all war captives offered for sale would have been bought by the Portuguese, so their captors had to find something else to do with them. Rodney believes that executing them was rare and that they would have been used for local labor. 1. There is a time lag between the time a slave is captured and the time he or she is sold. Thus there would often have been a pool of slaves awaiting sale, who would have been put to work. There are possible additional reasons for the adoption of slavery by the locals to meet their labor requirements. 1. The Europeans provided an example for imitation. 1. Once slaving in any form is accepted, it may smash a moral barrier to exploitation and make its adoption in other forms seem a relatively minor matter. 1. Export slaving entailed the construction of a coercive apparatus which could have been subsequently turned to other ends, such as policing a captive labor force. 1. The sale of local produce. For example, the palm kernels to Europeans opened a new sphere of economic activity. In particular, it created an increased demand for agricultural labor. Slavery was a way of mobilizing an agricultural workforce. This local African slavery was much less harsh and brutal than the slavery practiced by Europeans on, for example, the plantations of the United States, the West Indies, and Brazil. The local slavery has been described by anthropologist Emma Culloch. Quote, "Slaves were housed close to the fresh tracts of land they cleared for their masters. They were considered part of the household of their owner, and enjoyed limited rights. It was not customary to sell them except for a serious offense, such as adultery with the wife of a freeman. Small plots of land were given to them for their own use, and they might retain the proceeds of crops they grew on these plots. By this means it was possible for a slave to become the owner of another slave. Sometimes a slave married into the household of his master and rose to a position of trust. There is an instance of a slave taking charge of a chiefdom during the minority of the heir. Descendants of slaves were often practically indistinguishable from free men. Slaves were sometimes sent on errands outside the kingdoms of their masters and returned voluntarily. Speaking specifically of the era around 1700, historian Christopher Fife relates that slaves not taken in war were usually criminals. In coastal areas, at least, it was rare for anyone to be sold without being charged with a crime. Voluntary dependence reminiscent of that described in the early Portuguese documents mentioned at the beginning of this section was still present in the 19th century. It was called pawning. Arthur Abraham describes a typical variety. Quote, "A freeman heavily in debt, and facing the threat of the punishment of being sold, would approach a wealthier man or chief with a plea to pay off his debts, while I sit on your lap. Or he could give a son or some other dependent of his to be for you, the wealthy man or chief. This in effect meant that the person so pawned was automatically reduced to a position of dependence, and if he was never redeemed, he or his children eventually became part of the master's extended family. By this time, the children were practically indistinguishable from the real children of the master, since they grew up regarding one another as brothers." Some observers consider the term slave to be more misleading than informative when describing the local practice. Abraham says that in most cases, subject, servant, client, serf, pawn, dependent, or retainer would be more accurate. Domestic slavery was abolished in Sierra Leone in 1928. McCulloch reports that at that time, amongst Sierra Leone's largest present-day ethno-linguistic group, the Mende, who then had about 560,000 people, about 15% of the population. That is, 84,000 people, were domestic slaves. He also says that singularly little change followed the 1928 decree. A fair number of slaves returned to their original homes, but the great majority remained in the villages in which their former masters had placed them or their parents. Export slavery remained a major business in Sierra Leone from the late 15th century to the mid-19th century. According to Fife, it was estimated in 1789 that 74,000 slaves were exported annually from West Africa, about 38,000 by British firms. In 1788, a European apologist for the slave trade estimated the annual total exported from between the Nunes River, 110 kilometers north of Sierra Leone, and the Chevreuse 3,000. The Atlantic slave trade was banned by the British in 1807, but illegal slave trading continued for several decades after that. Part 3: Main Invasions. 16th century. The main invasions of the mid-16th century had a profound impact on Sierra Leone, the Maine, also called Mani. The southern members of the Man language group were a warrior people, well-armed and well-organized, who lived east and possibly somewhat north of present-day Sierra Leone, occupying a belt north of the coastal peoples. Sometime in the early 16th century they began moving south, according to some men who spoke to a Portuguese, Dornelles. In the late 16th century, their travels had begun as a result of the expulsion of their chief, a woman named Macario, from the imperial city in Mandimansa, their homeland. Their first arrival at the coast was east of Sierra Leone, at least as far away as River Ses and likely farther. They advanced northwest along the coast towards Sierra Leone, conquering as they went. They incorporated large numbers of the people they conquered into their army, with the result that by the time they reached Sierra Leone, the rank and file of their army consisted mostly of coastal peoples. The Maine were its commanding group. The Maine used small bows, which enabled Maines to reuse their enemies' arrows against them, while the enemy could make no use of the Maine's short arrows. Rodney describes the rest of their equipment thus, quote, "The rest of their arms consisted of large shields made of reeds, long enough to give complete cover to the user, 2 knives, one of which was tied to the left arm, and 2 quivers for their arrows. Their clothes consisted of loose cotton shirts with wide necks and ample sleeves reaching down to their knees to become tights. One striking feature of their appearance was the abundance of feathers stuck in their shirts and their head caps." By 1545, the Maine had reached Cape Mount, near the southeastern corner of present-day Sierra Leone. Their conquest of Sierra Leone occupied the ensuing 15 to 20 years, and resulted in the subjugation of all or nearly all of the indigenous coastal peoples, who were known collectively as the Sapes. As far north as the Scarseas, the present demographics of Sierra Leone is largely a reflection of these 2 decades. The degree to which the Maine supplanted the original inhabitants varied from place to place. The Temen partly withstood the Maine onslaught, and kept their language, but became ruled by a line of Maine kings. The present-day Loco and Mend are the result of a more complete submersion of the original culture. Their languages are similar, and both essentially Mand. In their oral tradition, the Mend describe themselves as being a mixture of 2 peoples. They say that their original members were hunters and fishers who populated the area sparsely in small peaceful settlements, and that their leaders came later, in a recent historical period, bringing with them the arts of war, and also building larger, more permanent villages. This history receives support from the facts that their population consists of 2 different racial types, and their language and culture show signs of a layering of 2 different forms. They have both matrilineal and patrilineal inheritance. For instance, the Maine invasions militarized Sierra Leone. The Sapes had been unwarlike, but after the invasions, right until the late 19th century, bows, shields, and knives of the Maine type had become ubiquitous in Sierra Leone, as had the Maine battle technique of using squadrons of archers fighting in formation, carrying the large-style shields. Villages became fortified. The usual method of erecting 2 or 3 concentric palisades, each 4 to 7 meters, 12 to 20 feet high, created a formidable obstacle to attackers. Especially since, as some of the English observed in the 19th century, the thick logs planted into the earth to make the palisades often took root at the bottom and grew foliage at the top, so that the defenders occupied a living wall of wood. A British officer who observed one of these fortifications around the time of the 1898 Hut Tax War ended his description of it thus. He also said that English artillery could not penetrate all 3 fences. At that time, at least among the Mend, a typical settlement consisted of walled towns and open villages or towns surrounding it. After the invasions, The main sub-chiefs among whom the country had been divided began fighting among themselves. This pattern of activity became permanent, even after the main had blended with the indigenous population, a process which was completed in the early 17th century. The various kingdoms in Sierra Leone remained in a fairly continual state of flux and conflict. Rodney believes that a desire to take prisoners to sell as slaves to the Europeans was a major motivation to this fighting, and may even have been a driving force behind the original main invasions. Historian Kenneth Little concludes that the principal objective in the local wars, at least among the men, was plunder, not the acquisition of territory. Abraham cautions that slave trading should not be exaggerated as a cause. The Africans had their own reasons to fight, with territorial and political ambitions present. Motivations likely changed over time during the 350-year period. The wars themselves were not exceptionally deadly. Set-piece battles were rare, and the fortified towns so strong that their capture was seldom attempted. Often the fighting consisted of small ambushes. In these years, the political system was that each large village along with its satellite villages and settlements would be headed by a chief. The chief would have a private army of warriors. Sometimes several chiefs would group themselves into a confederacy, acknowledging one of themselves as king or high chief. Each paid the king fealty. If one were attacked, the king would come to his aid, and the king could adjudicate local disputes. Despite their many political divisions, the people of the country were united by cultural similarity. One component of this was the Poro, an organization common to many different kingdoms and ethno-linguistic groups. The Mende claim to be its originators, and there is nothing to contradict this. Possibly they imported it. The Temne claim to have imported it from the Sherbero or Boulem. The Dutch geographer Olfert Dapper knew of it in the 17th century. It is often described as a secret society, and this is partly true. Its rights are closed to non-members, and what happens in the Poro bush is never disclosed. However, its membership is very broad. Among the Mende, almost all men, and some women, are initiates. In recent years it has not, as far as is known, had a central organization. Autonomous chapters exist for each chiefdom or village. However, it is said that in pre-protectorate days there was a Grand Poro with cross-chiefdom powers of making war and peace. It is widely agreed that it has a restraining influence on the powers of the chiefs. Headed by a fearsome principal spirit, the Gbeni, it plays a major role in the rite of passage of males from puberty to manhood. It imparts some education. In some areas, it had supervisory powers over trade and the banking system, which used iron bars as a medium of exchange. It is not the only important society in Sierra Leone. The Sand is a female-only analogue of it. There is also the Humoy, which regulates sex, and the Nja and the Wand. The Kpa is a healing arts collegium. The impact of the main invasions on the Sapes was obviously considerable, in that they lost their political autonomy. There were other effects as well. Trade with the interior was interrupted, and thousands were sold as slaves to the Europeans. In industry, a flourishing tradition in fine ivory carving was ended. However, improved iron working techniques were introduced. Part 4, 1600 to 1787. In the 17th century, Portuguese imperialism waned and, in Sierra Leone, the most significant European group became the British. By 1628, they had a factory trading post in the vicinity of Sherbero Island, about 50 kilometers, 30 miles, southeast from present-day Freetown. At that time the island was easily accessible from the coast, and elephants were still living there. One commodity they purchased was camwood, a hard timber, from which also could be obtained a red dye. The Portuguese missionary, Baltazar Barra, left Sierra Leone in 1610. Jesuits, and later in the century, Capuchins, continued the mission. By 1700 it had closed, although priests occasionally visited. A company called the Royal Adventurers of England trading into Africa received a charter from Charles II of England in 1663 and subsequently built a fort in the Sherbro and on Tasso Island in the Freetown estuary. They were plundered by the Dutch in 1664, the French in 1704, and pirates in 1719 and 1720. After the Dutch raid, the Tasso Island fort was moved to nearby Bunce Island, which was more defensible. The Europeans made payments, called coal, for rent, tribute, and trading rights, to the king of an area. At this time the local military advantage was still on the side of the Africans, and there is a 1714 report of a king seizing company goods in retaliation for a breach of protocol. Local Afro-Portuguese often acted as middlemen, the Europeans advancing them goods to trade to the local people, most often for ivory. In 1728, an overly aggressive company governor united the Africans and Afro-Portuguese in hostility to him. They burnt down the Bunce Island fort and it was not rebuilt until about 1750. The French wrecked it again in 1779. During the 17th century the Tem ethno-linguistic group was expanding. Around 1600, Amani still ruled the Loco Kingdom, the area north of Port Loco Creek, and another ruled the upper part of the south shore of the Freetown estuary. The north shore of the estuary was under a Bullum king, and the area just east of Freetown on the peninsula was held by a non-Mani with a European name, Dom Philip de Leone, who may have been a subordinate to his Mani neighbor. By the mid-17th century this situation had changed. Tem, not Bullum, was spoken on the south shore, and ships stopping for water and firewood had to pay customs to the Tem king of Bure, who lived at Bargos Town on the point between the Rokel River and Port Loco Creek. The king may have considered himself a Mani. To this day, Tem chiefs have Mani-derived titles, but his people were Tem. The Bure king in place in 1690 was called Bautura, by being a Mani form. The Tem had thus expanded in a wedge toward the sea at Freetown, and now separated the Bullum to the north from the Mani and other Man speakers to the south and east. In this period there are several reports of women occupying high positions. The king of the South Shore used to leave one of his wives to rule when he was absent, and in the Sherbro there were female chiefs. In the early 18th century, a Bullum named Signora Maria had her own town near Cape Sierra Leone. During the 17th century, Muslim Fula from the upper Niger and Senegal rivers moved into an area called Fouta-Djallon, or Fouta-Djallon, in the mountainous region north of present-day Sierra Leone. They were to have an important impact on the peoples of Sierra Leone because they increased trade and also produced secondary population movements into Sierra Leone. Though the Muslim Fula first cohabited peaceably with the peoples already at Fouta-Djallon, around 1725 they embarked on a war of domination, forcing the migration of many Susu, Yalunka, and non-Muslim Fula, Susu. Some already converted to Islam came south into Sierra Leone, in turn displacing Limba from northwest Sierra Leone and driving them into north-central Sierra Leone where they continue to live. Some Susu moved as far south as the Tem town of Port Loco, only 60 kilometers, 37 miles, upriver from the Atlantic. Eventually a Muslim Susu family called Sengo supplanted the town's Tem rulers. Other Susu moved westward from Fouta-Djallon, eventually dominating the Baga, Bullum, and Tem north of the Scarces River. The Yalunka in Fouta-Djallon first accepted Islam, then rejected it and were driven out. They went into north-central Sierra Leone and founded their capital at Falaba in the mountains near the source of the Rokel. It is still an important town, about 20 kilometers, 12 miles, south of the Guinea border. Other Yalunka went somewhat farther south and settled amongst the Goranko, Kissi, and Limba. Besides these groups, who were more or less unwilling emigrants, a considerable variety of Muslim adventurers went forth from Fouta-Djallon. A Fula called Fula Mansa. Mansa, meaning king, became ruler of the Leone country 100 kilometers, 62 miles, east of present-day Freetown. Some of his Tem subjects fled south to the Bantu country between the middle reaches of the Bagu and Jong rivers, where they became known as the Mabanta Tem. In 1652, the first slaves in North America were brought from Sierra Leone to the Sea Islands off the coast of the southern United States. During the 18th century, there was a thriving slave trade from Sierra Leone to the plantations of South Carolina and Georgia, where their rice farming skills made them particularly valuable. Britain and British seafarers, including Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Frobisher and Captain Brown, played a major role in the transatlantic trade in captured Africans between 1530 and 1810. The Treaty of Utrecht of 1713, which ended the Spanish War of Succession, 1701 to 1714, had an additional clause, the ASEAN Toe, that granted Britain, among other things, the exclusive rights over the shipment of captured Africans across the Atlantic. Over 10 million captured Africans were shipped to the Caribbean islands and the Americas, and many more died during the raids, the long marches to the coast, and on the infamous Middle Passage due to the inhumane conditions in slave ships. Britain outlawed the slave trade on the 29th of March 1807 with the Slave Trade Act 1807, and the British Navy operating from Freetown took active measures to stop the Atlantic slave trade. Part 5, The Province of Freedom, 1787 to 1789. Part 5, The Province of Freedom, Chapter 1, Conception of the Province of Freedom, 1787. In 1787, a plan was established to settle some of London's black poor in Sierra Leone in what was called the Province of Freedom. This was organized by the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor, founded by British abolitionist Granville Sharp, which preferred it as a solution to continuing to financially support them in London. Many of the black poor were African Americans, who had been given their freedom after seeking refuge with the British Army during the American Revolution, but also included other West Indian, African and Asian inhabitants of London. Part 5, The Province of Freedom, Chapter 2, Establishment, Destruction and Re-establishment, 1789. The area was first settled by 400 formerly enslaved Black Britons, who arrived off the coast of Sierra Leone on the 15th of May 1787, accompanied by some English tradesmen. They established the Province of Freedom, or Granville Town, on land purchased from local Khoisan Tem subchief King Tom and Regent Nyambana, a purchase which the Europeans understood to cede the land to the new settlers forever. The established arrangement between Europeans and the Khoisan Tem did not include provisions for permanent settlement, and some historians question how well the Khoi leaders understood the agreement. Disputes soon broke out, and King Tom's successor, King Jimmy, burnt the settlement to the ground in 1789. Alexander Falconbridge was sent to Sierra Leone in 1791 to collect the remaining black poor settlers, and they re-established Granville Town, later renamed Kleintown, near Fura Bay. Although these 1,787 settlers did not establish Freetown, which was founded in 1792, the bicentennial of Freetown was celebrated in 1987. After establishing Granville Town, disease and hostility from the indigenous people eliminated the first group of colonists and destroyed their settlement. A second Granville Town was established by 64 remaining black and white old settlers under the leadership of St. George Bay Company leader Alexander Falconbridge and the St. George Bay Company, This settlement was different from the Freetown settlement and colony founded in 1792 by Lieutenant John Clarkson and the Nova Scotian settlers under the auspices of the Sierra Leone Company. Part 6. Freetown Colony 1792 to 1808. Part 6. Freetown Colony Chapter 1. Conception of the Freetown Settlement 1791. The basis for the Freetown Colony began in 1791 with Thomas Peters, an African-American who had served in the Black Pioneers and settled in Nova Scotia as part of the Black Loyalist migration. Peters travelled to England in 1791 to report grievances of the Black Loyalists who had been given poor land and faced discrimination. Peters met with British abolitionists and the directors of the Sierra Leone Company. He learned of the company's plan for a new settlement at Sierra Leone. The directors were eager to allow the Nova Scotians to build a settlement there. The London-based and newly created company had decided to create a new colony, but before Peters' arrival had no colonists. Lieutenant John Clarkson was sent to Nova Scotia to register immigrants to take to Sierra Leone for the purpose of starting a new settlement. Clarkson worked with Peters to recruit 1,196 former American slaves from free African communities around Nova Scotia such as Bucktown. Most had escaped Virginia and South Carolina plantations. Some had been born in Africa before being enslaved and taken to America. Part 6. Freetown Colony Chapter 2. Settlement by Nova Scotians 1792. The settlers sailed in 15 ships from Halifax, Nova Scotia and arrived in St. George Bay between the 26th of February and the 9th of March 1792. 64 settlers died en route to Sierra Leone, and even Lieutenant Clarkson was ill during the voyage. Upon reaching Sierra Leone, Clarkson and some of the Nova Scotian captains dispatched on shore to clear or make roadway for their landing. The Nova Scotians were to build Freetown on the former site of the first Granville town, which had become a jungle since its destruction in 1789. Though they built Freetown on Granville town's former site, their settlement was not a rebirth of Granville town, which had been re-established at Fora Bay in 1791 by the remaining old settlers. Clarkson told the men to clear the land until they reached a large cotton tree. After this difficult work had been done and the land cleared, all the settlers, men and women, disembarked and marched towards the thick forest and to the cotton tree, and their preachers, all African Americans, began singing. Poem quotation: "Awake and sing of Moses and the Lamb. Wake, every heart and every tongue, to praise the Saviour's name. The day of Jubilee is come. Return ye ransomed sinners home." On the 11th of March 1792, Nathaniel Gilbert, a white preacher, prayed and preached a sermon under the large cotton tree, and Reverend David George preached the first recorded Baptist service in Africa. The land was dedicated and christened Freetown, according to the instructions of the Sierra Leone Company directors. This was the first Thanksgiving service in the newly christened Freetown and was the beginning of the political entity of Sierra Leone. Later, John Clarkson would be sworn in as the first governor of Sierra Leone. Small huts were erected before the rainy season. The Sierra Leone Company surveyors and the settlers built Freetown on the American grid pattern, with parallel streets and wide roads, with the largest being Water Street. On the 24th of August 1792, the black poor old settlers of the second Granville town were incorporated into the new Sierra Leone colony but remained at Granville town. It survived being pillaged by the French in 1794 and was rebuilt by the Nova Scotian settlers. By 1798, Freetown had 300 to 400 houses with architecture resembling that of the American South, with 3 to 4 feet stone foundations and wooden superstructures. Eventually this style of housing, brought by the Nova Scotians, would be the model for the odd houses of their Creole descendants. Part 6, Freetown Colony Chapter 3, Settlement by Jamaican Maroons and Freed Slaves in Transit. 1800. In 1800, the Nova Scotians rebelled, and it was the arrival of 500 Jamaican Maroons which caused the rebellion to be suppressed. 34 Nova Scotians were banished and sent to either the Sherbrooke or a penal colony at Gore. Some of these were eventually allowed back into Freetown. Following their capture of the rebels, the Maroons were granted the land of the Nova Scotian rebels. Eventually the Maroons had their own district at Maroon Town. The Maroons were a free community of blacks from Trelawney Parish who had been resettled in Nova Scotia after surrendering to the British government. They had petitioned the British government for settlement elsewhere due to the climate in Nova Scotia. After the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron was stationed in Freetown to intercept and seize ships participating in the illegal slave trade. The slaves that were held on these vessels were released into Freetown and were called captured Negroes, recaptives, or liberated Africans. Part 7, Colonial Era. 1808 to 1961. Part 7, Colonial Era Chapter 1, Establishment of the British Crown Colony. 1808. In 1808, the British Crown Colony of Sierra Leone was founded, with Freetown serving as the capital of British West Africa. The city's population expanded rapidly with freed slaves, who established suburbs on the Freetown Peninsula. They were joined by West Indian and African soldiers who settled in Sierra Leone after fighting for Britain in the Napoleonic Wars. Part 7, Colonial Era Chapter 2, Intervention and Acquisition of the Hinterland. 1800s–1895. In the early 1800s, Sierra Leone was a small colony extending a few kilometers, a few miles, up the peninsula from Freetown. The bulk of the territory that makes up present-day Sierra Leone was still the sovereign territory of indigenous peoples such as the Mendon-Temne, and was little affected by the tiny population of the colony. Over the course of the 19th century, that gradually changed. The British and Creoles in the Freetown area increased their involvement in and their control over the surrounding territory by engaging in trade, which was promoted and increased through treaty-making and military expeditions. In their treaties with the native chiefs, the British were largely concerned with securing local peace so that commerce would not be interrupted. Typically, the British government agreed to pay a chief a stipend in return for a commitment from him to keep the peace with his neighbors. Other specific commitments extracted from a chief might include keeping roads open, allowing the British to collect customs duties, and submitting disputes with his neighbors to British adjudication. In the decades following Britain's prohibition of the slave trade in 1807, the treaties sometimes also required chiefs to desist from slave trading. Suppression of slave trading and suppression of inter-chiefdom war went hand in hand because the trade thrived on the wars and caused them. Thus, to the commercial reasons for pacification could be added anti-slavery ones. When friendly persuasion failed to secure their interests, the British were not above, to borrow Carl von Clausewitz's phrase, continuing diplomacy by other means. At least by the mid-1820s, the army and navy were going out from the colony to attack chiefs whose behavior did not conform to British dictates. In 1826, Governor Turner led troops to the Bumkittum area, captured 2 stockaded towns, burnt others, and declared a blockade on the coast as far as Cape Mount. This was partly an anti-slaving exercise and partly to punish the chief for refusing territory to the British. Later that year, acting Governor Macaulay sent out an expedition which went up the Jong River and burned Comenda, a town belonging to a related chief. In 1829, the colonial authorities founded the Sierra Leone Police Corps. In 1890, this force was divided into the civilian police and the frontier police. The British developed a modus operandi which characterized their interventions throughout the century. Army or frontier police, with naval support if possible, would bombard a town and then usually torch it after the defenders had fled or been defeated. Where possible, local enemies of the party being attacked were invited by the British to accompany them as allies. In the 1880s, Britain's intervention in the hinterland received added impetus because of the scramble for Africa, an intense competition between the European powers for territory in Africa. In this case, the rival was France. To forestall French incursion into what they had come to consider as their own sphere, the British government renewed efforts to finalize a boundary agreement with France and on the 1st of January 1890 instructed Governor Hay in Sierra Leone to get from chiefs in the boundary area friendship treaties containing a clause forbidding them to treat with another European power without British consent. Consequently, in 1890 and 1891 Hay and two traveling commissioners, Garrett and Aldridge, went on extensive tours of what is now Sierra Leone obtaining treaties from chiefs. Most of these were not, however, treaties of Eschen, they were in the form of cooperative agreements between two sovereign powers. In January 1895, a boundary agreement was signed in Paris, roughly fixing the line between French Guinea and Sierra Leone. The exact line was to be determined by surveyors. As Christopher Fife notes, the delimitation was made almost entirely in geographical terms. Rivers, watersheds, parallels. Not political. Samu chiefdom, for instance, was divided. The people on the frontier had to opt for farms on one side or villages on the other. More generally, the arbitrary lumping together of disparate native peoples into geographical units decided by the colonial powers has been an ongoing source of trouble throughout Africa. These geographical units are now attempting to function as nations but are not naturally nations, being composed in many cases of peoples who are traditional enemies. In Sierra Leone, for example, the Mende, Tem and Creoles remain as rival power blocks between whom lines of fission easily emerge. Part 7, Colonial Era Chapter 3, Establishment of the British Protectorate and further land acquisition. 1895. In August 1895, an order in council was issued in Britain authorizing the colony to make laws for the territory around it, extending out to the agreed-upon boundary, which corresponds closely to that of present-day Sierra Leone. On the 31st of August 1896, a proclamation was issued in the colony declaring that territory to be a British protectorate. The colony remained a distinct political entity. The protectorate was governed from it. Most of the chiefs whose territories the protectorate subsumed did not enter into it voluntarily. Many had signed treaties of friendship with Britain, but these were expressed as being between sovereign powers contracting with each other. There was no subordination. Only a handful of chiefs had signed treaties of Eschen, and in some of those cases it is doubtful whether they had understood the terms. In remote areas no treaties had been obtained at all. Strictly speaking, a protectorate does not exist unless the people in it have agreed to be protected. The Sierra Leone Protectorate was more in the nature of a unilateral acquisition of territory by Britain. Almost every chieftaincy in Sierra Leone responded to the British arrogation of power with armed resistance. The Protectorate Ordinances, passed in the colony in 1896 and 1897, abolished the title of king and replaced it with paramount chief. Chiefs and kings had formerly been selected by the leading members of their own communities. Now all chiefs, even paramount ones, could be deposed or installed at the will of the governor, and most of the judicial powers of the chiefs were removed and given to courts presided over by British district commissioners. The governor decreed that a house tax of 5s to 10s was to be levied annually on every dwelling in the protectorate. To the chiefs, these reductions in their power and prestige were unbearable. Part 7, Colonial Era Chapter 4, Hut Tax War 10 and Mend Uprisings. 1898. When attempts were made to collect the house tax in 1898, the chiefs and their people rose up, first in the north, led by a dominant Tem chief called Biburef, and then in Mend country to the south. The two risings together are referred to as the Hut Tax War of 1898, though they had quite different characteristics. Biburef's forces conducted a disciplined and skillfully executed guerrilla campaign which caused the British considerable difficulty. Hostilities began in February. Biburef's harassing tactics confounded the British at first, but by May they were gaining ground. The rainy season interrupted hostilities until October, when the British resumed the slow process of eliminating the African stockades. When most of these defences had been eliminated, Biburef was captured or surrendered. Accounts differ. In November, the Mend War was a mass uprising, planned somehow to commence everywhere on 27 and the 28th of April, in which almost all outsiders, whether European or Creole, were seized and summarily executed. Although more fearsome than Biburef's rising, it was amorphous, lacked a definite strategy, and was suppressed in most areas within 2 months. Some Mend rebels in the center of the country were not beaten until November, however, and Mend King Niagua's son Magi, in alliance with Simkisi, continued to fight in the extreme east of the Protectorate until August 1899. The principal of the uprisings, Biburef, Niagua and Bishobro, Gbana Lewis, were exiled to the Gold Coast on the 30th of July 1899. A large number of their subordinates were executed. Part 7, Colonial Era Chapter 5, Creole Descent in the High Colonial Period. 1898 to 1956. Element or table removed. Unsuitable for speech. In the early 19th century, Freetown served as the residence of the British governor who also ruled the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and the Gambia settlements. Sierra Leone also served as the educational center of British West Africa. Fura Bay College, established in 1827, rapidly became a magnet for English-speaking Africans on the West Coast. For more than a century, it was the only European-style university in Western Sub-Saharan Africa. After the Hut Tax War, there was no more large-scale military resistance to colonialism. Resistance and dissent continued, but took other forms. Vocal political dissent came mainly from the Creoles, who had a sizable middle and upper class of business people and European-educated professionals such as doctors and lawyers. In the mid-19th century they had enjoyed a period of considerable political influence, but in the late 19th century the government became much less open to them. They continued to press for political rights, however, and operated a variety of newspapers which governors considered troublesome and demagogic. In 1924, a new constitution was put in place, introducing elected representation. 3 out of 22 members. For the first time, with the first elections held on the 28th of October. Prominent among the Creoles demanding change were the bourgeois nationalist H.C. Bankole Bright, General Secretary of the Sierra Leone branch of the National Congress of British West Africa, NCBWA, and the Socialist ITA, Wallace Johnson, founder of the West African Youth League, WAYL. African resistance was not limited to political discussion. Sierra Leone developed an active trade union movement whose strikes were often accompanied by sympathetic rioting among the general population. Besides the colonial employers, Popular hostility was targeted against the tribal chiefs who the British had transformed into functionaries in the colonial system of indirect rule. Their role was to provide policing, collect taxes, and obtain corvée labor. Forced labor exacted from those unable to pay taxes. For the colonialists, in return, the colonialists maintained them in a privileged position over the other Africans. Chiefs not willing to play this role were replaced by more compliant ones. According to Kilson, the attitude of the Africans toward their chiefs became ambivalent. Frequently they respected the office but resented the exactions made by the individual occupying it. From the chief's point of view, the dilemma of an honorable ruler faced with British ultimatums cannot have been easy. Throughout the 20th century, there were numerous riots directed against tribal chiefs. These culminated in the Protectorate-wide riots of 1955 to 1956, which were suppressed only by a considerable slaughter of peasants by the army. After those riots, reforms were introduced. The forced labor system was completely abolished and reductions were made in the powers of the chiefs. Sierra Leone remained divided into a colony and a protectorate, with separate and different political systems constitutionally defined for each. Antagonism between the two entities escalated to a heated debate in 1947, when proposals were introduced to provide for a single political system. Most of the proposals came from the protectorate. The Creole, led by Isaac Wallace Johnson, opposed the proposals, the main effect of which would have been to diminish their political power. It was due to the astute politics of Sir Milton Margai that the educated protectorate elite was won over to join forces with the paramount chiefs in the face of Creole intransigence. Later, Margai used the same skills to win over opposition leaders and moderate Creole elements for the achievement of independence. In November 1951, Margai oversaw the drafting of a new constitution, which united the separate colonial and protectorate legislatures and, most importantly, provided a framework for decolonization. In 1953, Sierra Leone was granted local ministerial powers, and Margai was elected Chief Minister of Sierra Leone. The new constitution ensured Sierra Leone a parliamentary system within the Commonwealth of Nations. In May 1957, Sierra Leone held its first parliamentary election. The Sierra Leone People's Party, SLPP, which was then the most popular political party in the colony of Sierra Leone, won the most seats in parliament. Margai was also re-elected as chief minister by an overwhelming majority. Part 8, 1960 Independence Conference. On April 20, 1960, Sir Milton Margai led the Sierra Leonean delegation in the negotiations for independence at the constitutional conferences held with Queen Elizabeth II and British Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod at Lancaster House in London. All 24 members of the Sierra Leonean delegation were prominent and well-respected politicians, including Sir Milton's younger brother lawyer Sir Albert Margai, trade unionist C. Arcus Stevens, SLPP strongman Lamine Sanko, Creole activist Isaac Wallace Johnson, Paramount Chief Elikoblo Golama, educationist Mohammed Sanusi Mustafa, Dr. John Carver Smart, Professor Kandburef, lawyer Sir Banya Tejan C., former Freetown Mayor Eustace Henry Taylor Cummings, educationist Amadou Wuri, and Creole diplomat Hector Reginald Sylvanus Boltman. On the conclusion of talks in London, Britain agreed to grant Sierra Leone independence on the 27th of April 1961. Stevens was the only delegate who refused to sign Sierra Leone's Declaration of Independence, on the grounds that there had been a secret defense pact between Sierra Leone and Britain. Another point of contention by Stevens was the Sierra Leonean government's position that there would be no elections held before independence, which would effectively shut Stevens out of Sierra Leone's political process. Upon their return to Freetown on the 4th of May 1960, Stevens was promptly expelled from the People's National Party, PNP. Part 9, opposition to the SLPP government. In 1961, C. Arcus Stevens, a trade unionist and outspoken critic of the SLPP government, took advantage of the dissatisfaction with the ruling SLPP among some prominent politicians from the northern part of Sierra Leone. He formed an alliance with Sori Ibrahim Goroma, Christian Al-Luzine Kamara Taylor, Mohammed O. Bashtaki, Ibrahim Bashtaki, Esati, Goroma and C.A. Fofana, and formed a new political party called the All People's Congress, a PC, in opposition of the SLPP government, using the northern part of Sierra Leone as their political base. Part 10. Early Independence, 1961 to 1968. Part 10. Early Independence, Chapter 1, Sir Milton Margai Administration, 1961 to 1964. On the 27th of April 1961, Sir Milton Margai led Sierra Leone to independence from Britain and became the country's first Prime Minister. Sierra Leone retained a parliamentary system of government and was a member of the Commonwealth of Nations. In May 1962, Sierra Leone held its first general election as an independent nation. The Sierra Leone People's Party, SLPP, won plurality of seats in Parliament and Sir Milton Margai was re-elected as Prime Minister. The years just after independence were prosperous, with money from mineral resources being used for development and the founding of Njalo University. Sir Milton Margai was very popular among Sierra Leoneans during his time in power. An important aspect of his character was his self-effacement. He was neither corrupt nor did he make a lavish display of his power or status. His government was based on the rule of law and the notion of separation of powers, with multi-party political institutions and fairly viable representative structures. Margai used his conservative ideology to lead Sierra Leone without much strife. He appointed government officials with a clear eye to satisfy various ethnic groups. Margai employed a brokerage style of politics by sharing political power between political groups and the paramount chiefs in the provinces. Part 10. Early Independence, Chapter 2, Sir Albert Administration, 1964 to 1967. Upon Sir Milton Margai's death in 1964, his half-brother, Sir Albert Margai, was appointed as Prime Minister by Parliament. Sir Albert's leadership was briefly challenged by Sierra Leone's Foreign Minister John Khalifa Smart, who questioned Sir Albert's succession to the SLPP leadership position. Khalifa Smart received little support in Parliament in his attempt to have Margai stripped of the SLPP leadership. Soon after Margai was sworn in as Prime Minister, he immediately dismissed several senior government officials who had served under his elder brother's government, as he viewed them as traitors and a threat to his administration. Unlike his late brother, Sir Milton, Sir Albert Margai proved unpopular and resorted to increasingly authoritarian actions in response to protests, including the enactment of several laws against the opposition All People's Congress, a PC, and an unsuccessful attempt to establish a one-party state. Unlike his late brother, Sir Albert was opposed to the colonial legacy of allowing the country's paramount chiefs executive powers, and he was seen as a threat to the existence of the ruling houses across the country, almost all of whom were strong supporters and key allies of the previous administration. In 1967, riots broke out in Freetown against Sir Albert's policies. In response, Margai declared a state of emergency across the country. He was accused of corruption and of a policy of affirmative action in favor of his own and ethnic group. Sir Albert had the opportunity to perpetuate himself in power, but he elected not to do so even when the opportunities presented themselves. He had the police and the army on his side, and nothing could have prevented him from achieving his ambition to hold on to power, but he chose not to and called for free and fair elections. Part 10. Early independence Chapter 3, 3 military coups, 1967 to 1968. The APC narrowly won a small majority of seats in Parliament over the SLPP in a closely contested 1967 Sierra Leone general election, and APC leader C. Arcus Stevens was sworn in as Prime Minister on the 21st of March 1967 in Freetown. Within hours of taking office, Stevens was ousted in a bloodless military coup led by the commander of the army, Brigadier General David Lansana, a close ally of Sir Albert Margai, who had appointed Lansana to the position in 1964. Lansana placed Stevens under house arrest in Freetown and insisted the determination of office of the Prime Minister should await the election of the tribal representatives to the House. On the 23rd of March, a group of senior military officers in the Sierra Leone Army led by Brigadier Andrew Jukes Smith overrode this action by seizing control of the government, arresting Lansana, and suspending the constitution. The group constituted itself as the National Reformation Council, NRC, with Jukes Smith as its chairman and governor-general. On the 18th of April 1968, a group of senior military officers who called themselves the Anti-Corruption Revolutionary Movement, a CRM, led by Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, overthrew the NRC junta. The CRM juntas arrested many senior NRC members. The democratic constitution was restored, and power was handed back to Stevens, who assumed the office of Prime Minister. Part 11, Stevens Government and One-Party State, 1968 to 1985. Stevens assumed power in 1968 with a great deal of hope and ambition. Much trust was placed upon him as he championed multi-party politics. Stevens had campaigned on a platform of bringing the tribes together under socialist principles. During his first decade or so in power, Stevens renegotiated some of what he called useless pre-financed schemes contracted by his predecessors, Albert Margai of the SLPP and Jukes Smith of the NRC, which was said to have left the country in an economically deprived state. Stevens reorganized the country's refinery, the government-owned Cape Sierra Hotel, and a cement factory. He cancelled Jukes Smith's construction of a church and mosque on the grounds of Victoria Park. Stevens began efforts that would later bridge the distance between the provinces and the city. Roads and hospitals were constructed in the provinces, and paramount chiefs and provincial peoples became a prominent force in Freetown. Under pressure of several coup attempts, real and perceived, Stevens' rule grew more and more authoritarian, and his relationship with some of his ardent supporters deteriorated. He removed the SLPP from competitive politics in general elections, some believed, through the use of violence and intimidation. To maintain the support of the military, Stevens retained the popular John Amadou Bangura as the head of the Sierra Leone Armed Forces. After the return to civilian rule, by-elections were held. Beginning in autumn 1968, and all APC cabinet was appointed. Calm was not completely restored. In November 1968, unrest in the provinces led Stevens to declare a state of emergency. Many senior officers in the Sierra Leone military were greatly disappointed with Stevens' policies, but none could openly confront Stevens. Brigadier General Bangura, who had reinstated Stevens as Prime Minister, was widely considered the only person who could put the brakes on Stevens. The army was devoted to Bangura, and it was believed, in some quarters, that this made him potentially dangerous to Stevens. In January 1970, Bangura was arrested and charged with conspiracy and plotting to commit a coup against the Stevens government. After a trial that lasted a few months, Bangura was convicted and sentenced to death. He was hanged on the 29th of March 1970 in Freetown. Stevens named a junior officer, Joseph Seydou Momo, as the head of the Sierra Leone military. Major General Momo was a close ally and very loyal to Stevens. On the 23rd of March 1971, soldiers loyal to the executed Brigadier John Amadou Bangura held a mutiny in Freetown and other parts of the country in opposition of the Stevens government. Several soldiers were arrested for their involvement in the mutiny, including Corporal Fode Sanko, who was convicted of treason and jailed for 7 years at the Pademba Road prison. At Stevens' request to Guinean President Sékou Touré, a close ally, Guinean soldiers were stationed in Sierra Leone from 1971 to 1973 to help protect the government. In April 1971, a new Republican constitution was adopted under which Stevens became president. In the 1972 by-elections, the opposition SLPP complained of intimidation and procedural obstruction by the APC and militia. These problems became so severe that the SLPP boycotted the 1973 general election. As a result, the APC won 84 of the 85 elected seats. In the early 1970s, C. Arcus Stevens formed his own personal force known as the State Security Division, SSD. In order to protect him and to maintain his hold on power, many of the SSD officers were from the provinces and were very loyal to Stevens. The SSD was very powerful and operated independently under Stevens' direct command. The SSD officers guided Stevens and were deployed across Sierra Leone to put down any rebellion or demonstration against the Stevens government. An alleged plot to overthrow President Stevens failed in 1974. On the 19th of July 1975, 14 senior army and government officials including Brigadier David Lansana, former cabinet minister Dr. Mohamed Soure Fona, former cabinet minister and journalist Ibrahim Bashtaki and Lieutenant Habib Lansana Kamara were executed after they were convicted for attempting a coup. In March 1976, Stevens was re-elected president without opposition. In 1977, a nationwide student demonstration against the government disrupted Sierra Leone politics. However, the demonstration was quickly put down by the army and SSD officers. A general election was called later that year in which corruption was again endemic. The APC won 74 seats and the SLPP won 15 seats. In May 1978, the Sierra Leone Parliament, dominated by close allies of President Stevens' APC administration, approved a new constitution which made the country a one-party state. On the 12th of July 1978, official figures released by the government showed 97% of Sierra Leoneans voted in favor of the one-party state. The SLPP, other opposition parties and civil rights groups said the referendum votes were massively rigged, and that voters were intimidated by security forces loyal to Stevens. The 1978 Constitution referendum made the APC the only legal political party. All other political parties were banned, including the main opposition, the SLPP. This move led to another major demonstration against the government in many parts of the country, which was put down by the army and the SSD officers. The first elections under the new one-party constitution took place on the 1st of May 1982. Elections in about two-thirds of the constituencies were contested. Because of irregularities, the government cancelled elections in 13 constituencies. By-elections took place on the 4th of June 1982. The new cabinet appointed by Stevens after the election included several prominent members of the disbanded SLPP who had defected to the APC, including the new finance minister Salih Jusu Sherif, a former leader of the SLPP. Jusu Sherif's succession to the cabinet was viewed by many as a step toward making the APC a true national party. Stevens, who had been head of state of Sierra Leone for 18 years, retired from the position in November 1985 at the end of his term, although he continued his role as chairman of the ruling APC party. Many in the country had expected Stevens to name his vice president and loyal ally, Soure Ibrahim Goroma, as his successor. However, at the APC convention in August 1985, the APC named Major General Joseph Seydou Momo as Stevens' choice to succeed him as president. Momo was very loyal to Stevens, who had appointed him to head of the military 15 years earlier. Momo and Stevens were both members of the minority Limba ethnic group. Momo retired from the military and was elected president without opposition on the 1st of October 1985. A formal inauguration was held in January 1986, and new parliamentary elections were held in May 1986. Arcus Stevens is generally criticized for dictatorial methods and government corruption, but he reduced the ethnic polarization in government by incorporating members of various ethnic groups into his all-dominant APC government. Another legacy of Stevens was that for 18 years while he was in power, he kept the country safe from civil war and armed rebellion. Despite his dictatorial governing style, Stevens regularly interacted with the people of Sierra Leone by making surprise visits. Stevens also regularly made surprise visits to the poor merchants, where he was often seen buying his own food at a local market with his security team keeping their distance. Stevens often stood and waved to the Sierra Leonean people from an open car when traveling with his convoy. Part 12. Momo Government and IUF Rebellion 1985 to 1991. President Momo has strong links with the army, and his verbal attacks on corruption earned him much-needed initial support among Sierra Leoneans. With the lack of new faces in his cabinet, however, criticisms soon arose that Momo was simply perpetuating the rule of Stevens. Momo defended himself by integrating the powerful and independent State Security Force (SSD) into the Sierra Leone Police Force. The first years under the Momo administration were characterized by corruption, which Momo diffused by sacking several senior cabinet ministers. To formalize his war against corruption, President Momo announced a code of conduct for political leaders and public servants. After an alleged attempt to overthrow Momo in March 1987, more than 60 senior government officials were arrested, including Vice President Francis Minna, who was removed from office, convicted for plotting the coup, and executed by hanging with 5 others in 1989. In October 1990, due to mounting domestic and international pressure for reforms, President Momo created a commission to review the 1978 one-party constitution. Based on the commission's recommendations, a constitution re-establishing a multi-party system, guaranteeing fundamental human rights and the rule of law, and strengthening democratic structures, was approved by a 60% majority of the APC Parliament, ratified by referendum in September 1991 and became effective on the 1st of October. There was great suspicion that President Momo was not serious about his promise of political reform, as APC rule continued to be increasingly marked by abuses of power. Several senior government officials in Momo's administration resigned to oppose the APC in upcoming elections. Salia Jusu Sheriff, Abbas Bundu, J.B. Dauda and Sama Banya resuscitated the previously disbanded SLPP, while Themu Bangura, Edward Kagbo and Desmond Luke formed their own respective political parties to challenge the ruling APC. However, the vast majority of government officials, including Victor Bokarifo, Edward Ture, Hassan Gbaye Kanu and Osman Fode Yansana, remained loyal to Momo and the APC. Meanwhile, an increasing burden was placed on the country by the rebellion in the eastern part of Sierra Leone. Part 13. Civil War 1991 to 2001. The brutal civil war in neighboring Liberia played an undeniable role in the outbreak of fighting in Sierra Leone. Charles Taylor, leader of the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, reportedly helped form the Revolutionary United Front (RUF), under the command of former Sierra Leonean Army Corporal Fode Sanko, a critic of both the Stevens and Momo administrations. Sanko had been an ally of Brigadier General Bangura and was among those who mutinied following Bangura's execution. Sanko was British-trained and had undergone guerrilla training in Libya. Taylor's aim was for the RUF to attack the bases of Nigerian-dominated peacekeeping troops in Sierra Leone who were opposed to his rebel movement in Liberia. Sanko's RUF rebels entered the country in March 1991, and within a month controlled much of eastern Sierra Leone, including the diamond mining area in Kono district. The government of Sierra Leone, overwhelmed by a crumbling economy and corruption, was unable to mount significant resistance. At this time, the Momo government was crumbling. Several senior government officials had resigned to form opposition parties, while there were suspicions that President Momo was not serious about political reform. Abuses of power had continued, and the APC was alleged to have been hoarding arms and planning a violent campaign against the opposition parties ahead of multi-party general elections scheduled for late 1992. The state had been unable to pay civil servants, leading to the looting of government property and a population of aimless youth when schools were closed. Part 13, Civil War Chapter 1, NPRC Junta, 1992 to 1996. On the 29th of April 1992, 25-year-old Captain Valentine Strasser led a group of young Sierra Leone Army officers, including Lieutenant Sausamdi, Sergeant Solomon Musa, Lieutenant Tom Numa, Captain Komba Mondef, Captain Julius Marda Bio and Captain Komba Cambo, from their barracks in Galen district and launched a military coup in Freetown, which sent President Momo into exile in Guinea. The young soldiers established the National Provisional Ruling Council, NPRC, with Strasser as its chairman and head of state of the country. Captain Solomon Musa, a close friend of Strasser and one of the leaders of the coup, became the deputy leader of the NPRC junta. The coup was largely popular because it promised to bring peace, but the NPRC junta immediately suspended the constitution, banned all political parties, limited freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and enacted a rule-by-decree policy, in which soldiers were granted unlimited powers of administrative detention without charge or trial. The NPRC established a Supreme Council, consisting of the highest-ranking soldiers in the junta government. On the same day the NPRC junta took power, one of the coup leaders, Lieutenant Sausamdi, was assassinated, reportedly by Major Simtere, the head of Sierra Leone military intelligence, and a close ally of the deposed president. A heavily armed military manhunt took place across Sierra Leone to find Ture and others suspected to have participated in the assassination, forcing Ture to flee to Guinea. The NPRC junta fought the RUF rebels, recaptured most of the RUF-held territories, and pushed the rebels back to the border with Liberia. The NPRC junta maintained relations with the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWS, and strengthened support for Sierra Leone-based ECOWS Monitoring Group, ECOMOG, troops fighting in Liberia. In December 1992, an alleged coup attempt against the NPRC administration of Strasser was foiled. It had aimed at freeing from detention Colonel Yaya Kanu, LT Colonel Kahota MS Dumbuya, and former Inspector General of Police Bambe Kamara. Sergeant Mohammed Lamin Bangura and some junior army officers were identified as being behind the coup. 17 soldiers were executed, including Bangura, Kanu and Dumbuya. Several prominent members of the Momo government who had been in detention at the Pademba Road prison, including former Inspector General of Police Bambe Kamara, were also executed. On July 5, 1994, Deputy NPRC leader Solomon Musa was arrested and sent into exile in Guinea. Musa was accused by Strasser, on the advice of high-ranking NPRC soldiers, that he had become too powerful and was a threat to Strasser. Musa, who was a close ally and childhood friend of Strasser, denied the allegation and claimed his accusers were the threat. Strasser replaced Musa as deputy NPRC chairman with Captain Julius Marda Bio, and immediately promoted him to brigadier. Due to internal divisions between soldiers loyal to Musa and those who supported Strasser's decision to oust him, the NPRC's campaign against the RUF became ineffectual. More and more of the country fell to RUF fighters, and by 1994 the RUF held much of the diamond-rich eastern province and were at the edge of Freetown. In response, the NPRC hired several hundred mercenaries from the private firm Executive Outcomes. Within a month, they had driven RUF fighters back to enclaves along Sierra Leone's borders and cleared the RUF from the Kono diamond-producing areas of Sierra Leone. On the 16th of January 1996, after about 4 years in power, Strasser was arrested by his own bodyguards in a coup led by Bio and backed by many high-ranking soldiers of the NPRC junta. Strasser was immediately flown into exile in Conakry, Guinea. Bio stated in a public broadcast that his support for returning Sierra Leone to a democratically elected civilian government and his commitment to ending the civil war were his motivations for the coup. Part 13, Civil War Chapter 2, Return to Civilian Rule and First Kabila Presidency, 1996 to 1997. Promises of return to civilian rule were fulfilled by Bio, who handed power over to Ahmad Tejan Kabila of the Sierra Leone People's Party, SLPP. After the conclusion of elections in early 1996, President Kabila took power with a great promise of ending the civil war, opened dialogues with the then-defeated RUF and invited RUF leader Sanko for peace negotiations, signing the Abidjan Peace Accord on the 30th of November 1996. In January 1997, under international pressure, the Kabila government ended their contract with Executive Outcomes even though a neutral monitoring force had not arrived. This created an opportunity for the RUF to regroup and renew military attacks. Sanko was arrested in Nigeria, and by the end of March 1997 the peace accord had collapsed. Part 13, Civil War Chapter 3, a FRC Junta, 1997 to 1998. On May the 25th, 1997, a group of 17 soldiers in the Sierra Leone Army led by Corporal Tamba Gbori freed and armed 600 prisoners from the Pademba Road prison in Freetown. One of the prisoners, Major General Johnny Paul Goroma, emerged as the leader of the group, calling itself the Armed Forced Revolutionary Council, a FRC. The group launched a military coup and sent President Kabila into exile in Guinea. Goroma became head of state, with Gbori as deputy in command of the FRC. Goroma suspended the constitution, banned demonstrations, closed all private radio stations, and granted unlimited powers to soldiers. Goroma invited the RUF rebels to join his coup. Facing little resistance from army loyalists, 5,000 ragtag rebel fighters overran the capital. Goroma appealed to Nigeria for the release of Fode Sanko, appointing the absent leader to the position of deputy chairman of the FRC. The joint FRC/RUF coalition government then proclaimed the war had been won, and gave the soldiers and rebels unlimited powers in a great wave of looting and reprisals against civilians in Freetown. Dubbed Operation Pay Yourself by some of its participants. The FRC junta government was not recognized by any country. Whereas President Kabila's government in exile in Conakry, Guinea was recognized by the United Nations, the African Union, the United States, the United Kingdom and ECOWS as the legitimate government of Sierra Leone. The Kamajas, a group of traditional fighters mostly from the Mende ethnic group under the command of Deputy Defense Minister Samuel Hinga Norman, remained loyal to President Kabila and defended the southern part Sierra Leone from the rebels. The Kamajas and rebels, including the RUF soldiers, regularly fought each other, and human rights violations were committed by both sides. ECOWS, led by Nigerian head of state Sani Abacha, created a military force to defeat the FRC/RUF junta in Freetown and to reinstate President Kaba's government. Many West African countries sent troops to reinstate the Kaba government, assembling a force largely from Nigeria but also including soldiers from Guinea, Ghana, Togo, Gambia, Mali, Ivory Coast and Senegal. After 10 months in office, the FRC junta government was ousted and driven out of Freetown by the Nigeria-led ECOMOG forces. The democratically elected government of President Kaba was reinstated in March 1998. Goroma fled to the rebel strongholds in the east of the country. Part 13, Civil War Chapter 4, President Kaba's Return and the End of Civil War. 1998 to 2001. Kaba returned to power with Albert Joe Demby as vice president. President Kaba named Solomon Bera as Attorney General and Sama Bania as Foreign Minister. On the 31st of July 1998, President Kaba disbanded the Sierra Leone military and introduced a proposal for a new military. On the 12th of October 1998, 25 soldiers, including Bore, Brigadier Hassan Karim Kontef, Colonel Samuel Francis Goroma, Major Kulasamba and Colonel Abdul Karim Sesse, were executed by firing squad after they were convicted by court-martial for orchestrating the 1997 coup. A FRC leader Johnny Paul Goroma was tried in absentia and sentenced to death. ECOMOG was unable to achieve a tactical victory over the RUF, and the international community promoted peace negotiations. The Lomé Peace Accord was signed on the 7th of July 1999 to end the Civil War, granting amnesty for all combatants, and controversially granting Sanko the position of vice president and chairman of the commission that oversaw the diamond mines. In October 1999, the United Nations established the UNMSIL peacekeeping force to help restore order and disarm the rebels. The first of the 6,000-member force began arriving in December, and the UN Security Council voted in February 2000 to increase the force to 11,000, and later to 13,000. In May, when nearly all Nigerian forces had left and UN forces were trying to disarm the RUF in eastern Sierra Leone, the RUF took over 500 peacekeepers hostage, some of the rebels using captured weapons and armored personnel carriers to advance on the capital. The 75-day hostage crisis resulted in more fighting between the RUF and government forces as UN troops launched Operation Kouakri to end the siege. The operation was successful, with Indian and British special forces being the main contingents. The situation in the country deteriorated to such an extent that British troops were deployed in Operation Palliser, originally simply to evacuate foreign nationals. However, the British exceeded their original mandate and took full military action to finally defeat the rebels and restore order. The British were the catalyst for the ceasefire that ended the Civil War. Elements of the British Army, together with administrators and politicians, remained in Sierra Leone, helping to train the new armed forces, improve the infrastructure of the country and administer financial and material aid. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time of the British intervention, is regarded as a hero by the people of Sierra Leone, many of whom are keen for more British involvement. Citation needed. Sierra Leoneans have been described as the world's most resilient people. In 2004, Parliament passed a Local Government Act of 2004 which reintroduced local government councils back to Sierra Leone after 30 years. On the 4th of August 2006, in a broadcast to the nation, President Kaba announced that 2007 presidential and parliamentary elections would be held on the 28th of July 2007. Between 1991 and 2001, about 50,000 people were killed in Sierra Leone's civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced from their homes and many became refugees in Guinea and Liberia. In 2001, UN forces moved into rebel-held areas and began to disarm rebel soldiers. By January 2002, President Kaba declared the civil war officially over. In May 2002, Kaba was re-elected president by an overwhelming majority. By 2004, the disarmament process was complete. Also in 2004, an unbacked war crimes court began holding trials of senior leaders from both sides of the war. In December 2005, UN peacekeeping forces departed from Sierra Leone. Part 14, 2002 to present. Part 14, 2002 to present. Chapter 1, Kaba re-elected. 2002 to 2007. Elections were held in May 2002. President Kaba was re-elected, and the SLPP won a majority of the parliamentary seats. In June 2003, the UN ban on the sale of Sierra Leone diamonds expired and was not renewed. The UN Disarmament and Rehabilitation Program for Sierra Leone's fighters was completed in February 2004, by which time more than 70,000 former combatants had been helped. UN forces returned primary responsibility for security in the area around the capital to Sierra Leone's police and armed forces in September 2004. It was the last part of the country to be turned over. Some UN peacekeepers remained to assist the Sierra Leone government until the end of 2005. The 1999 Lome Accord called for the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which would provide a forum for both victims and perpetrators of human rights violations during the conflict to tell their stories and facilitate genuine reconciliation. Subsequently, the Sierra Leonean government and the UN agreed to establish the Special Court for Sierra Leone to try those who bear the greatest responsibility for the commission of crimes against humanity, war crimes and serious violations of international humanitarian law, as well as crimes under relevant Sierra Leonean law within the territory of Sierra Leone since the 30th of November 1996. Both the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Special Court began operating in the summer of 2002. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report to the government in October 2004. In June 2005, the government issued a white paper on the Commission's final report which accepted some but not all of its recommendations. Members of civil society groups dismissed the government's response as too vague and continued to criticize the government for its failure to follow up on the report's recommendations. In March 2003, the Special Court for Sierra Leone issued its first indictments. Fode Sanko, already in custody, was indicted, along with notorious RUF Field Commander Sam Mosquito Boukary, Johnny Paul Goroma, and Linga Norman, the Minister of Interior and former head of the Civil Defense Force, among several others. Norman was arrested when the indictments were announced, while Boukary and Goroma remained in hiding. On the 5th of May 2003, Boukary was killed in Liberia, allegedly on orders from President Charles Taylor, who feared Boukary's testimony before the Special Court. Goroma was also rumored to have been killed, though his death remains unconfirmed. Two of the accused, Fode Sanko and Linga Norman, have died while incarcerated. On the 25th of March 2006, with the election of Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo permitted the transfer of Charles Taylor, who had been living in exile in the Nigerian coastal town of Calabar, to Sierra Leone for prosecution. 2 days later, Taylor attempted to flee Nigeria, but he was apprehended by Nigerian authorities and transferred to Freetown under UN guard. Part 14, 2002 to present. Chapter 2, Koromas Government. 2007 present. In August 2007, Sierra Leone held presidential and parliamentary elections. They had a good turnout and were initially judged by official observers to be free, fair and credible. However, no presidential candidate won the 50% plus one vote majority stipulated in the constitution on the first round of voting. A runoff election was held in September 2007, and Ernest Bai Koroma, the candidate of the APC, was elected president and sworn in the same day. In his inauguration address at the National Stadium in Freetown, President Koroma promised to fight corruption and the mismanagement of the country's resources. By 2007, there had been an increase in the number of drug cartels, many from Colombia, using Sierra Leone as a base to ship drugs to Europe. It was feared that this might lead to increased corruption and violence and turn the country, like neighboring Guinea-Bissau, into a narco state. President Koroma quickly amended the existing legislation against drug trafficking. Inherited at independence in 1961. To address the international concerns, increasing punishment for offenders in terms of prohibitive fines, lengthier prison terms, and provision for extradition of offenders wanted elsewhere, including the United States. In 2008, an aircraft carrying almost 700 kilograms of cocaine was caught at Freetown's airport and 19 people, including customs officials, were arrested, and the Minister for Transport was suspended. In 2014, the country was impacted by the 2014 Ebola virus epidemic in Sierra Leone. This recording is a derivative work from Wikipedia. For more information, please visit www.frogcast.org.